tästä nyt koneita.
Okei, sä varmaan neuvot miten toi. Ja se on tää vai?
Sillä voi powerbankia.
Joo. Sitten mun pitää olla se video. Niin kuin se näkyy tässäkin vai? Ei kun täällä näkyy joku. Ei kun näkyy. Jäi.
Tää on nyt silleen, että toimii tästä näin.
Joo.
Mut sitten jos
Nyt jos täytyy ottaa se oma juttu sieltä.
Enso, hiiren oikealla Enso.
Okei.
Ja ne on työpöydällä.
No varmaan tän.
Katsi laittaa tietysti valmiiksi kaikki tuohon. Kokeillaan että se lähtee päälle.
Ole voi ottaa easy ja kirjoitella biisi. Kaveri, jonka näet monen kuukauden jälkeen. Ja se on sulle tärkeä. Oli sitten aika, ilta tai aamu. Ei lopeteta, kunnes biisi valmiiksi on saatu. Äänitetä vaatekaapissa, jos ei oo tilaa. Vaatteet ja viikattu kaikkia likaa. Tila ympäriltua eri fiiliksi.
Tästä kun tuplaklikkaa,
Ole voi
niin
ottaa
tässä
easy ja
tuplaklikkaa.
kirjoitella biisi. Kaveri, jonka näet monen kuukauden jälkeen. Ja se on sulle tärkeä. Oli
Nyt
sitten
se lähti
aika,
jatkaa
ilta
siitä,
tai
mihin se
aamu.
jäi. Niin laitetaan se tonne alkuun. Kokeillaan nyt uudestaan.
Ole voi ottaa easy ja kirjoitella
Tää on kyllä
biisi.
hetkinen,
Kaveri,
tähän voitais laittaa tänne näin. Että se on tossa valmiina täällä taustalla. Onks toi nyt?
Se on se. Sitä, mikäs se nyt oli?
Onko se tää sama kuin mikä tämäkin?
Taustalla, se on varmaan se.
Niin se on se sama, joo.
Ja sitten oli se mun esitys on siellä. Niin, niin nyt se on toi siltä tunnistaa sen ainakin hyvin.
Niin se on tuo.
Juu. Ja sitten se mun esitys oli
Mikäs sen nimi oli? Ei täällä oo se.
siellä ylhäällä, eka.
Tuo.
Joo.
Niin lataa sekin valmiiksi tähän näin. No siinä työpöydällä nyt saman tien. Ne voi laittaa kansiokin. Tää on siis tämmönen, että tää ei oo niinku tarvi osoittaa mihinkään tää toimii.
Okei, no ehkä mä käytän sitä. Sitten kun tää on loppu.
Niin hiiren oikealla tuosta, missä tahansa.
Joo.
End show.
Joo.
Ja sitten täältä.
Joo. Sitten jos mä
Ja-
mä rupeen.
Ja kun tästä tuplaklikkaa ja playtä.
ole
Tässä
voi ottaa easy ja kirjoitella biisi. Kaveri,
jätään tuo alkuun. Se on aina tuplaklikillä, sen vaihtaa koko ruudun ja
Joo.
ikkunan tilaa.
Okei.
Niin nyt se on siinä vaiheessa tosiaan, että kun sen laittaa tähän tilaan, niin se on playllä päällä saman tien.
Joo.
Mutta kun sitä ei mene kukaan muu säätämään, niin kyllä se toimii. Hetkinen, täällä on nyt. Tuo on se varsinainen, mikä on tässä. Se on suolla,
Takana.
tosta kun pistää tuohon, niin
Joo.
tästä löytyy
Ja siitä
tää
se on oikealla vai vasemmalla?
No, vasemmalla on tässä.
Ja vasemmalla tuplaklihatti oikeastaan
Joo,
kaikki
joo.
täällä vasemmalla.
Se on ainoastaan siinä koko ruudun tilassa, kun mäkin haluan lopettaa, niin hiiren oikealla saa tämän valikon näkyviin.
Okei.
Muuten se menee
No. Tän hoitaa joku muu tän alun. Niin.
Niin joo, että sulla ei ole tätä.
Mulla ei ole tätä vetovastuuta tässä.
Katsotaan
Ja varmaan toi Maija kattoo kans tänne, että miten tää toimii, jollei se tiedä.
Niin. Toi on toi ekaa, joo. Joo, katon, että se. Joo. Pistetään tuo, mikä on ollut tuossa. Toi nimittäin tämä, meillä on nyt striimiin menee nimenomaan tämä kuva, mikä tässä näkyy.
Joo.
Me tehdään muuten sitä tallenne erikseen, että saatte sen sitten niin kuin ihan videotiedostonakin, jos haluatte laittaa vähän niin kuin jälkikäteen leikeltyneen ja muuta. Ei kyllä sinne nimiplanssit tulee ja näin päin pois, että niitähän ei leikellä. Mutta siis tässä niin tuohon striimiin, kun se tallentuu, niin siihenhän tulee alkuun kauheasti tyhjää ja turhaa. Että sitten kun haluaa laittaa sen saman jakon sinne teidän YouTube-kanavalle, niin kannattaa siitä laittaa sitten tuo jälkikäsite tai tuo, mikä saatte meiltä sitten.
Mitä jos tässä tulee jotain säätöä, joku ei saa esitystä?
Virastomestarin pitää huutaa paikalle. Niin, noin siniset miehet. Me ei päästä tuolta ylhäältä käymään tässä. Niin. Muuten toimii niin kuin normit tietokoneet, mutta ainut vaan, että kun on langaton yhteys tuonne tietokoneelle, että niin kuin materiaali pitää viedä tuonne etukäteen valmiiksi. Niitä ei voi tässä laitella mihinkään. Joo. Toisin niin vähän ne pysyy niinku tuossa mikrofonien takana.
Sanotaan, että pysytään, missä pysytään.
Niin, sanokaa, että siitä ei lähetä.
Niin, ei meillä tänään tässä ole kuin 2 pääpuhujaa ja sitten noin chairit ja avaajat. Niin. Sitten se paneeli varmaan huomenna täytyy.
Toimii noin mikit, mutta sitten se on kukaan kannalta hankala, että vaeltamaan ja sitä.
Mä en tiedä, jos jotain yleisöpuheenvuoroja tulee, mä en tiedä, miten te pystytte ohjaamaan hyväksytäänkö sit vaan se, että sitten ei näy kuka puhuu.
Robokamera on, että sitten on laajalla kuva palautteena, voidaan vähän sinne päin kääntää sitä tarvittaessa. Ei se oikein muuten onnistu, kun se henkilö pitäisi tulla tähän eteen sitten kysymään, jos se halutaan naama näkyviin.
No ei ehkä tarvitse, jos ääni sitten kuuluu, että mikrofoni
Niin, jos haluaa äänen, niin on pakko käyttää myös kysyjän mikrofonia.
Sitten huomenna varmaan tarvitsee
No noin virastomestarit.
uudestaan möhlata tää sitä. Yes, we are looking at the presentation, so which one is it?
The PowerPoint, that one there, you can
Yep.
just put that on the desktop.
Yes.
maybe. Yeah.
Then I think we can remove this.
Yeah. Is there anywhere that I can print something out? The printer in my hotel was out of ink and I couldn't. I have my laptop. If there isn't
Yeah.
one, that's okay. But if there is, it might be easy for me to do that.
Would you need the prints now?
No, just before the presentation at some point. But
Yeah.
if I can't, then that's okay. I have my laptop as well.
I'll just check that this works.
All these notes as well. There
Yeah.
we go. Yeah.
And where is the...
Hei! Lämpimästi tervetuloa teille kaikille. Tämä on ihana nähdä teitä kaikkia täällä. I'm going to transfer to English now because one of our keynote speakers doesn't speak Finnish. So welcome everybody. It's great to see you here and it's wonderful we got the snowy weather, not the other alternative that we could have had, that we often have here at this time. I'm being asked to inform you that the whole event will be streamed, or the lectures here. So if you make any comments, please ask for a mic. Where are the mic people? Well, let's hope the mic people show up when you have comments. It's my pleasure to ask Eila Estola, the Dean of Faculty of Education, to welcome you more officially. Thank you, Eila. Please come up.
Dear conference guests, it's my pleasure to be here, and I think that there are two very good reasons why this conference must be here in Oulu. The first one is that I think that many of you might know that actually the youngest population in European Union area lives here in Oulu area. So we are very young when thinking about our population. And then the second good reason is that we often think that Finland is very much about Helsinki and capital area. And when I read your conference website, I noticed that you want somehow arise this issue that how could we listen to those people and study those phenomena which actually comes from other directions or from other discourses compared to this kind of capital areas. So I'm really happy that you are here. And when I came here from the other end of this campus, I actually noticed that there are thousands of young people during these days on campus area because we have apipäivät. So we have thousands of young people from senior secondary schools here. So that is some kind of extra bonus to have this conference here, and they remind us about this topic of Youth Research Society. As we all know, this year Finland celebrates its 100th anniversary. And according to many indicators, Finland is one of the best countries in the world. But is it best for everybody? Is it even good for everybody? We know the answer, unfortunately not. So we need to ask, who are those who are not visible, whose voices are not heard? And in my opinion, as its best, research can help to answer on these questions. By studying people and issues that often are and become forgotten. In this conference, you want to raise discussion about this silence phenomena in youth, especially in youth research, and also in politics and in social practices also, in my mind. That's what I understood from the conference information. And I appreciate this effort very, very much. When thinking about youth research, methodological commitments and methods are actually connected to what we can see, what we can find, and what we can hear. I have one very personal experience about this issue. During my doctoral studies, I spent half a year in Israel, in Haifa. and I couldn't understand a word about the language. And I still believe that was one a kind of like option that I became to discover the importance of body language, and the importance of all the senses what we have when we want to capture and catch some knowledge and information around us. And so that was something very important for me, and I noticed that this kind of issues maybe become talked more in some of these keynotes as well. For me, narrative research and understanding that we need to use all the senses in research has been one way to see what is not so easy to see. So I come from the narrative research field. How we approach the phenomena has consequences to the research results as well. So it's not just choosing some method, but it has serious epistemological and ontological consequences as well. I want to tell you an example that, in my opinion, can be applied, for instance, in collecting research material with young people, but in my mind, it has also consequences in all kinds of practices, not only with young people, but with every one of us. A few days ago, I read once again Nell Nording's article, The Caring Relationship in Teaching. In that article, Nording points out that often when we want to understand the students, we actually act based on the assumed needs of the young people. We think that we know the needs of the young. And Nell Nording said that it is not the best way, it's not even the right way, that instead we should act on the basis of expressed needs. And in order to understand what these expressed needs are, in my mind, we need all the senses, but Nording says that we must learn to listen. And she cites philosopher Simone Weil by saying that maybe we should ask, what are you going through? And then Nording translates this question to a bit more, maybe easier question. Let me hear you think. And I think, in my mind, I think that this is a good question when we try to learn the perspective of young people themselves. And I have another example as well, if I have 2 minutes time, do I? Another example about a person who has often forgotten, although some researchers say that he should earn to become known as important persons as, for instance, Maria Montessori or A.S. Neil with his Summerhill philosophy. This man was Janusz Korczak, alias Henrik Goldsmith, born 1868. Does anybody of you know the name? Okay. After this conference, you can Google and you will find a lot of material from him. Janusz Korczak was a Polish Jew in Warsaw, a pediatric, a pedagogue, and an author. He is said to be one of the ancestors of Children's Rights Agreement. He was a director of Orphans' Home. He established a kind of a republic including its own parliament, court, and a newspaper. And he was running this orphans' home. I think that he has even 2 of them for several years. He also spoke against corporal punishment and emphasized children's rights to respect. And during the Holocaust, Korczak stayed with his orphans when the children were sent to the Treblinka extermination camp. Although Korczak was often offered sanctuary, so he, as a volunteer, accompanied children to the Treblinka camp, and he died there. So, okay, Korczak's story is a kind of hero story. But I told this story not only for that reason, but to show that often brilliant ideas can exist when we don't know anything about them. And that is why every step to broaden our research horizon is also important. So, on behalf of the Faculty of Education, I'm really glad that you have this conference here in our university. And I wish you all a very successful conference and all the best in your work for the best of the young people. Thank you.
Thank you, Eila. Our first keynote speaker, Dr. David Ferrucci, is a sociologist based in Australia. He does extremely interesting and important work which supports the development of strong regional communities in Australia. Dr. Ferrucci studies with esteemed funding how youth in regional areas are responding to conditions of high unemployment and industrial restructuring. We're so happy you're here. Warmly welcome, and have fun.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for such a warm welcome. I want to start today by thanking the Finnish Youth Research Network for inviting me to Finland. It's really wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to have the privilege of traveling to the other side of the world, to a place where youth research is so strong globally and is so well institutionalized nationally. So it's really great for me to come and connect with the wonderful tradition of youth research here in Finland. So I want to start today by reflecting a little, first of all, on the importance of the theme of this conference and on reflecting on the role of rurality and the meaning of rurality as a silence in youth research. I think that examining the idea of silences in academic work is an important and productive way to start to look at the position that rural research has in the development of youth studies, and indeed in the historical and theoretical and epistemological development of the social sciences in general. Because what I will suggest in this presentation and what I will develop for you today is to argue that whilst notions of rurality are positioned as marginal to theoretical development in youth studies, that this is not just an exclusion from the field, nor is this merely a gap in the literature that can be addressed by better targeted empirical research. In fact, there is lots of great, very high quality empirical research examining the experiences of rural youth, which I'll be talking about today. Instead, I want to argue that the absence of rurality from the key theoretical debates in our field, and therefore from the debates that most significantly shape the research agendas that we participate in, is more than a gap, but is what in post-structuralist terms could be described as a constitutive exclusion. That is, an exclusion which is critical to the formation of the field as such. So the issue here is not merely that rurality is silent in youth research, but that the silence of rurality is a means by which the field has developed in the way that it has. In this sense, it's a loud silence, a silence that echoes throughout the theoretical development of the social sciences and of youth studies. So the consequences of this argument go beyond the need for more finely tuned empirical research. And what I want to suggest here is that exploring this silence has important theoretical and epistemological implications for the way that the field understands not just rural youth, but the concept of youth as such, both in a local context and globally. So in this respect, rurality can be seen as a new and critical epistemological position from which to understand youth and from which to connect empirical and theoretical debate in studies of youth with broader concepts in social theory, including debates about the nature of globalization and the character of modernity. Okay. So, to start this argument, we can look at the theoretical status of rurality from the perspective of the development of the social sciences in general, from the earliest thinkers, which we now think of as forming the classical basis for social science, and especially for the discipline that I come from, which is sociology. The development in these classical and contemporary sociological theories have had a big impact on many aspects of youth studies and on the theoretical agendas that shape the field. And the silencing of rurality within youth research is not merely a characteristic of youth studies, but reflects the earliest assumptions made about what the social sciences were and what was distinctive about different social scientific disciplines. And these assumptions shape both classical theory and some of the key contemporary theoretical agendas in our field, such as, for instance, concepts of globalization, late modernity, and individualization, as in the work of Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens. So, some separation between the urban and the rural, or between the town and the country, and an emphasis or a privileging of the urban as the site for sociological analysis has been a trend that has underpinned all of the development of sociological theory. The emergence of cities and the process of urbanization has been taken to be a key hallmark, in fact, of the notion of modernity itself, which is a concept that remains a critical focal point for the development of social science and for sociology as a discipline. In the earliest theories that form the basis for this, for the narrative of modernity, the classical work of Emile Durkheim, Ferdinand Tönnies, and Marx all describe modernity and modern social relations as taking place and, in a sense, producing the space of the city. So, Emile Durkheim's narrative of the movement from mechanical to organic solidarity describes shifts from homogeneous and unchanging social relations to complex and individualized societies located in urban spaces. and modernity is, of course, characterized by the organic solidarity of the latter. Karl Marx described urban life and the conditions of the urban for the working class as critical to the concept of alienation, which for Marx described a key aspect of subjectivity in general under capitalism. And Ferdinand Tönnies described the distinction between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft in very similar terms. So in this sense, the concept of modernity positions social life as that which takes place within cities, whereas rural areas are positioned in the past and often associated with pre-modern forms of social life. So in this respect, this spatial division is made into an intellectual division and is in fact made into one of the key concepts which has and currently organises social theory. This exclusion is constitutive both of the concept of modernity and of the discipline of sociology itself. And this continues in theories of social change, including the work of Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens, which continue to have a significant impact on the sociology of youth. Whilst earlier sociological narratives described urbanisation as fundamental to the creation of modern capitalism, the urbanisation of modernity is taken for granted in the next generation of sociological thinking about social change. And in fact, the narrative is very similar, although concepts like late modernity and individualisation purport to describe very different epochs. They tell a very similar story. So Ulrich Beck's narrative of the movement from first to second modernity describes the dissolution of collective class solidarities built around industrial modes of production. He describes modernity as theorized through the concept of individualization, in which the dissolution of these structures and the increasingly complex and insecure nature of modern social life creates increasingly reflexive and individualized identities. Giddens' book, The Consequences of Modernity, emphasizes the importance of cultural and economic globalization, the decline in traditional class and gendered identities, and for Anthony Giddens, the decrease in the significance of locality and local social relationships for organizing people's identities and for, indeed, sociological theory in general. So for Giddens, modern identities are individual creations, reflexively crafted, no longer rooted in locality. The development of notions of youth is connected with the emergence of these narratives of modernity. And in fact, the concept of youth and the concern with youth as an object of intellectual interest is deeply tied up with both this historical and intellectual history. The work of Nancy Lesko comes to mind here, who has described the way that the notion of youth as a developmental process that unfolds over time, emerged with and in the context of the colonial social relationships. And in fact, notions of youth were positioned as rehearsals of the evolution of the human species, which were themselves used to understand spatial divisions in the world that were part of colonial social relationships. So, the intellectual history of youth has key implications for how we understand the basis of the social sciences in general. And the exclusion of particular places, particular spatial contexts, and of notions of rurality from theoretical development in the field is not just a gap in the literature, but an exclusion that is formative of the field itself. The spatial distinctions that have made their way into our intellectual frameworks are also part of broader geographies of knowledge production that privilege particular places. In particular, that privilege the metropolitan centres of economically significant countries as the key intellectual vantage points for understanding youth. In general, the experiences that are most often included in theoretical developments in youth studies are those of young people in the metropolitan centres of the global north, in cities that also operate as key economic and cultural hubs in a global context. In this sense, the epistemological devalorization of rural youth is an aspect of broader cultural economies which privilege the value and significance of lives from powerful localities. It's necessary for us to take this relationship into account. That is, the relationship between economic, cultural and political power and the broader epistemological valorizations and devalorizations that structure academic work. We need to take this into account in order to understand both the silences in theoretical development in the field and the marginalization of rurality, as well as the critical potential of rural research for new theoretical engagements. So in what remains of this discussion, I want to share some thoughts with you about what this might actually look like for the way that we understand youth as an object of study. In particular, what I want to do is suggest that rural youth can offer an epistemological vantage point on youth which demonstrates it as a heterogeneous and mobile phenomenon located not within one place, but rather distributed across global networks of capital, labour and culture. And in this sense, I want to position rural youth on the cutting edge of the dynamics of contemporary globalisation, including processes of economic restructuring that have produced the large urban centres that dominate contemporary youth studies. I also want to suggest that studying rurality is a means by which to understand and interrogate the critical role that notions of place, locality and space play within broader processes of mobility and globalisation. One of the key theoretical resources for this, I think, is what could be described as the spatial turn in social theory, or the increasing use of spatial thinking in the social sciences and the increasing interdisciplinary theoretical engagement between sociology and cultural and critical geography. The reason for this is that both the concept of modernity and the concept of youth is wrapped up in the privileging of time and of temporality as the key to understanding societies. The geographer Doreen Massey has talked about the way that in the history of social theory, time is positioned as the category that we can use to understand change, to understand politics, to understand the dynamism of modern social life. Whereas notions of space were understood as inert, as uninteresting. Space, historically, has been seen as the container within which time happens. Moving beyond these ideas of space as inert has been key for both the development of rural research and for the theoretical development in social science in general. It's only through the privileging of time that the history of one kind of space has been made into the history of the social sciences in general, and indeed has come to stand for history in general. By privileging time, urban histories have come to stand for history in general, at least in terms of the theoretical development of sociological theory. One way of moving forward from this is to understand space as something which is intrinsic to social relations and which is produced by social practices. And for this reason, as a dynamic, changing and mobile dimension of the social world. Space is in this sense produced both economically, culturally and through intellectual work. Henry Lefebvre was one of the earliest Marxist analysis of the production of space. The work of David Harvey has described the way that capitalist globalization takes place through the formation of spatial difference, both between and within regions. One of the key touchstones in this area is, of course, the work of John Urry, who has used notions of space, a focus on spatiality, and an emphasis on mobilities to move beyond the basic category that social science has until recently been based on, that is, the category of society. John Urry has suggested that examining mobilities and spatialities in this respect reveals the spaces of social life as porous, interconnected, and open, constantly under revision and always being connected in new ways. This moves us beyond a focus on the territorial boundaries of particular places and beyond a focus on the territorial boundaries of particular nation states. And I think in this context we can start to think more productively about what the epistemological status of rurality could be for the social sciences. One way of doing this is to understand rural youth not as located within the category of the rural, but rather as wrapped up in the production of rurality itself as part of broader global economic and cultural processes and mobilities. One of the key examples of the way that of the production of rurality, ironically, is work by Saskia Sassen on the economic power of the global city in contemporary capitalism. Saskia Sassen has shown the way that contemporary economic flows go between not just nation states, but between cities, and that it's economic flows between cities that concentrate economic power. So, in the metropolitan centres of the global north, the shift to a service economy has been key to the dynamics of contemporary globalisation and has taken place in such a way as to privilege the city, and particular cities in fact, both economically and culturally. Saskia Sassen describes these global cities as command and control centres for the global economy. Centres that command and control global flows of economic capital and labour that transnational corporations rely on in order to do business. It's in these cities that the increasingly heterogeneous and increasingly precarious service economies that so dominate studies of young people and work, for instance, are located. Many key texts in the field, texts that have come to be emblematic of the relationship between youth and work, are focused on urban service economies. The other side of the emergence of the global city is, of course, high levels of rural youth unemployment and the need for economically driven migration that I'll be talking about later on. But not just economically, the dynamics of contemporary popular and youth culture also operate in such a way as to attribute cultural value to urban spaces and to devalorize the rural. In his early and widely cited work, Distinction, Pierre Bourdieu notes that elegance, taste, sophistication, and cultural refinement have come to be associated with the concept of the city, whereas the country is associated and characterized as conservative, rough, or backwards. The spectacular youth cultures that so much youth research focuses on, such as those focused on cultural production and consumption connected with music, for instance, are urban phenomenon. They are linked to and made possible by the large and heterogeneous leisure and cultural industries to be found in urban spaces. And these urban youth cultures have become critical to the field of youth studies. In many respects, urban youth cultures are starting to be discussed as though they stand for youth subjectivities in general. A great example of this is the emergence of debates about the relationship between transitions and cultural theories in youth studies, with these debates taking place as though studies of urban youth cultures stand for studies of youth identity and creativity in general. In a paper published in the Journal of Youth Studies, I've described this as the circulation of metrocentric economies of cool, in which global flows of youth cultural symbols operate to valorize urban ways of living as cool, cutting-edge, sophisticated, fun, and to position rural ways of life as rustic, boring, and out of touch. In many respects, the concentration of youth cultural symbols in cities and the popular association between youth and urban centres in general has meant that some rural young people describe youthfulness, youth itself, as something which can only be practiced in the city. So I think that by positioning urban youth cultures as symbolic of youth identities as a whole, youth studies has to some degree actually participated in and contributed to the metrocentric economies of cultural distinction that shape and give meaning to the difference between the city and the country. So I want to suggest that, at least when it comes to young people, these are the key dynamics that structure the production of rurality. And these are the dynamics that we can start to see when we begin from the position of rurality as an epistemological vantage point for understanding youth in a global context. So what then, when we begin from this position, can we learn about youth in general? I want to suggest that one key insight into these dynamics is the emergence of a particular constellation and a particular global organisation of rural youth mobilities that can be seen all over the world, and that I want to suggest are critical to the nature of rural youth and are critical to the production of rurality itself in the contemporary world. So, understood as a constitutive exclusion, rurality can be made into a critical site for understanding the dynamics of contemporary globalisation, and rural youth mobilities are key to the way that this can take place. Whilst mobility has become an important theme throughout sociology in general over the last couple of decades, the production, negotiation and experience of mobility for contemporary rural youth has a particular significance. And this is connected to their devalorisation in relation to the urban. The concentration of material, symbolic and discursive resources for experiencing and practicing youthful identities creates what I think can be called a mobility imperative for rural youth. Young people are forced in one way or another to form a relationship with whatever is experienced and defined as outside of their locality. The issue of what is outside is not such a big deal for urban youth, whereas the imperative to be mobile shapes all aspects of rural young people's biographies and subjectivities, even for those youth who do not actually themselves migrate. This imperative is also something that we can see on a global scale in the lives of rural young people across the world, whose lives are changing with economic restructuring and within symbolic flows of contemporary popular culture. One aspect of this is the position of rural youth within broader mobilities of capital and labour. With increasing structural inequalities between cities and rural places, rural young people are forced to develop a relationship to the urban and are increasingly dependent on urban capital in order to survive. Anxieties about high levels of rural youth outmigration have emerged in this context and are often brought up by members of rural communities when they talk about the possibility or impossibility of the future of their own local place. Rural young people often migrate to the city in order to access work or study opportunities that are not available in their local places. Indeed, in many respects, both in the work that I've done in Australia and in the literature more globally, migrating out is taken for granted in the aspirations of rural youth for education and work. And the value of migrating out is recognised even for those young people who can't do it. Success, the successful experience of youth and the successful movement to adulthood is in this sense equated with the aspiration for mobility and for the capacity to actually migrate. The capacity for mobility The capacity to manage this mobility has become central to the way that local social class relationships operate, both in the structure of rural places and in the lives of young people. Whereas class relationships within cities are often taken for granted as located within the urban, understanding class and its relationship to rural youth requires an understanding of the relationship between the rural and the urban, and it requires an understanding of mobility. As young people with the requisite cultural and economic capital migrate to the city, an inability to move due to a lack of resources often means that young people are positioned as failures within the definition of successful transitions to adulthood in terms of mobility. Mobility in this respect is valorized and is seen as a practice that contributes to the valorization and devalorization of youth. Mobility, however, is not necessarily that easy. Rural young people who do move face unique difficulties adjusting to life in the city in the absence of family and community networks, and this has been documented in a range of different national contexts. Some colleagues of mine in Australia, Hanan Cuervo and Joanna Wynne, have described the way that urban capital is also critical for young people who wish to return to their home communities. And they've documented the way that educational qualifications acquired in cities allow young people to create new employment opportunities in rural labour markets and thereby to change the nature of rurality in general. In this respect, even for young people who remain attached to and committed to their local environment, access to the urban is key for their capacity to do that and for their capacity to build lives in rural places. Remaining local is increasingly synonymous with precarity and notions of social exclusion, for better or worse. Whilst these processes are familiar to us, they also influence countries outside of the wealthy post-industrial economies of the global north and outside of the usual focal points of youth studies. Obviously, it's impossible to generalize about the global south in general, but the experiences of young people in the global south are also silences in theoretical development in youth research, despite containing the majority of the world's youth and despite being themselves demographically young. But in countries where agricultural production is critical to the national economy, efforts at development and economic growth have taken place through a repositioning of the rural and the urban within the dynamics of the global economy. And there's evidence that the rural mobility imperative is in this respect tied up with the neoliberal politics of global development as they apply to the global south. For example, there's a lot of great literature by anthropologists and development studies scholars on the way that agricultural production has changed in the global south and how this has impacted on the experiences of young people. These scholars have shown that intergenerational transfers of agricultural land are being interrupted as land is sold to global agribusinesses, with the blessing of governments hoping that the selling of this land will contribute to efforts of national economic development. The work of Cindy Katz has documented what she's called the eroding ecologies of childhood and youth in rural Sudan due to the restructuring of the rural economy to focus on export-oriented cash crops that were seen as synonymous with development and economic growth. In the absence of opportunities for farming, families in this context are recruited into cash cropping schemes and increasingly struggle to survive in the face of low prices for their crops. High levels of youth unemployment have emerged in this context and in other places in the global south. So the mobility imperative is a product not just of deindustrialization and the centrality of global cities, but is also related to the economic and political dimensions of development projects oriented towards changing the position of the global south in global commodity flows. So examining this aspect of rural youth mobility and associating the notion of youth in general with these processes shows that the position of young people within the global mobility of capital and labour is key both to the dynamics of globalisation and to some of the key concerns in contemporary sociological theory. In fact, examining these labour-related mobilities also teaches us something about the global city and about how the impact of the emergence of the global city has changed rurality. In this sense, rural youth mobilities are constitutive of these global dynamics and not outside of them. I also want to suggest that these dynamics and this constitutive role of rural youth can also be seen in the way that popular culture moves around the world. So, whilst rural young people are embedded in global mobilities of capital and labour, leisure and concepts of youth culture have also come to be critical signifiers of the distinction between the city and the country. Globalisation theorists like Arjun Appadurai have shown that contemporary culture is mobile and produces cultural spaces that transgress established territorial boundaries, including those between nation-states and those between cities and the countryside. As images and understandings of leisure practices circulate around the world, young people's cultural investments and practices have come to represent important symbolic distinctions that map onto spatial and territorial divisions. As I discussed earlier when I talked about metrocentric economies of cool, cities are now located as the site where popular culture happens, or where youth culture may be practiced. And other leisure activities, especially those connected with the natural environment, have come to stand for the concept of rurality in popular culture. If young people wish to take up the subjectivities offered by contemporary youth culture, they have to become mobile, either imaginatively or through actual migration. And there's evidence that actual migration practices across territorial borders are driven not merely by the desire for education and work, but by the desire to take up identities offered by urban taste cultures. Both imaginative mobilities and these actual migrations, therefore, are embedded within and produce a complex relationship to metrocentric cultural distinctions. They produce the difference between cities and the countryside. Recent research that I conducted in Australia in this context showed that many rural young people described their own localities as places in which nothing happened, as places that were defined by the absence, in particular, of popular cultural symbols. Their biographical narratives of their past and their future were constructed and organised around strong investments in the possibility of mobility and in the imagination of mobilities to metropolitan centres that they imagined as exciting and cool and youthful. Metropolitan centres that for this reason were described as the locus of the future. The use of digital technologies facilitate connections with places and social groups across the world. And these subjectivities are constructed through the appropriation of popular cultural symbols, which provide the resources for young people to locate themselves in multiple spaces and places, including the urban metropole. The geographer Matthew Lation in the United Kingdom has done some great work on this, showing that in some instances, rural young people can maintain investments in metropolitan youth cultures that cause them to feel more at home in visits to cities than in their own local communities. In these instances, metropolitan youth cultures operate as spaces for mobile youth imaginaries that are created through the investment in multiple spaces, even when young people don't move. Samantha Punch has also described the way that this takes place in rural Bolivia. Samantha Punch has shown that when young people respond to the mobility imperative, they move not just through geographical reasons, but through symbolic hierarchies that give meaning to space and that give meaning to their lifestyles. The migration practices of the rural Bolivian young people that Punch examines describes young people who work for months in agricultural and domestic labour in nearby cities or in nearby communities, primarily in order to facilitate their own popular cultural consumption. In the course of these migrations, young people save lots of money and live very bare lives in order to be able to buy clothes, stereos, and other symbols of metropolitan youth culture not available in their rural places of origin. This also allows these young rural migrants to return home periodically to participate in the community in new ways, ways that are based on the cultivation of a particular kind of local cool due to the symbolic display of urban taste cultures. So Samantha Punch argues that these mobilities provide access to symbols of prestige and the capacity to consume. And she suggests that migration is a strategy that facilitates young people's position in the global economy. So, the mobility imperative for rural youth has a symbolic dimension produced by the symbolic concentration of youthfulness within the city, a process which is disturbing established notions of place attachment for contemporary rural youth and entirely reorganising both the cultural and structural dimensions of rural young people's lives. The symbols and practices that in a real sense define youthfulness are themselves mobile, produced in the city, consumed by young people across both urban and rural areas, and organised around metrocentric economies of cultural distinction that associate rurality with cultural exclusion. But again, these processes show us that rurality is not just absent here, but is a constitutive exclusion. The positioning of rurality in these contexts is critical to the way that global youth culture moves and the way that youth culture gives meaning to young people's lives in different places. So studying the circulation of cultural flows from a rural position shows how youth culture in general is formed and how the formation and movement of youth culture contributes to the production of urban and rural space. So in becoming mobile, young people engage with the discursive and symbolic distinctions that permeate what I think we can see as the landscape of contemporary youth cultures. They offer different subjectivities to young people in different places. And these flows and practices constitute the symbolic dimensions of a mobility imperative that I would suggest shapes rural young people's lives across the globe. The final aspect of this mobility imperative that I want to describe is in many respects a kind of caution about the celebration of mobility within contemporary sociological theory. Because whilst it's important to recognise the interaction between mobility and rurality for understanding young people's lives, living in a rural area is not just about the absence of the urban, but is associated with unique forms of embodied place attachment that interact with mobilities in complex ways. In a study I conducted in rural Australia a few years ago, I found that the nature of rural life, including participation in agricultural labour and in leisure activities such as hiking and hunting, these practices create a particular kind of embodied relationship to place and to the natural environment that is unique to rural youth, and that continues in the embodied experiences of the self for young people who do migrate to urban places. In this study, rural young people described the sounds and spaces of their locality as important aspects of their day-to-day lives. And when they left these localities, they weren't able to just celebrate the city in the way that they had anticipated. They actually felt uncomfortable in their own bodies. They were unable to connect in an easy way with the movements and spaces and rhythms of the city. So I'll just share with you a really small piece of data here from a young person who says very simply, "It's weird for me to be in town. It's just a weird feeling." This is a young guy who lived on a farm, and for him, town was a place that it would take you 30 seconds to drive through in your car. But for him, it was a different kind of space than he was used to in an embodied sense. So what these kinds of embodied place attachments show is that there are limits to mobility, and that they're shaped around existing place attachments that reveal contemporary youth subjectivities as complex and ambivalent. So I'll skip over this next bit so that I can conclude. So, the mobility imperative for young people, for rural young people, has a number of consequences. It produces what has been described as trans-local subjectivities, or lives that are made possible through the necessary engagement with multiple spaces, drawing upon economic and cultural capital located in the urban whilst remaining in the rural locality is an aspect of the way that these translocal subjectivities emerge. Youth is, in this sense, a spatially distributed phenomenon, organised around mobile and sometimes contradictory spatialities. Rurality, in this respect, is an epistemological position for understanding youth in general. The flows of capital and culture that produce this translocality have something to say not just about rurality, but about youth as an idea. Rural young people are inextricably connected with places outside their own local areas. It's compulsory for them to form a relationship with the outside. But what I think is critical to keep in mind is that these experiences can teach us about the mobility, heterogeneity, and network nature of youth in general. All young people are embedded within these mobilities, even if they're more of a problem for some than others. So to conclude, what I hope to suggest here is that when we examine the silences of youth research, we don't just fill gaps in our field. We understand new understandings of youth in general, and we generate new epistemological positions for understanding not just young people's lives, but also for connecting the empirical and theoretical debates in our field within broader concepts and debates within the social sciences, such as the nature of modernity and the way to approach space and time in a global context in general. So I will conclude there. Thank you so much for listening today.
Thank you so much. I'm sure there are many questions and comments, and we'd like to save them to the end. And I'll introduce our next keynote. Well, the next speaker doesn't, Leena Suurpää, needs no introductions here. She's been the head of, was the long-time director of the Finnish Youth Research Society. She's currently the director of youth-related issues in Finnish Red Cross, and she's the second chairman in the Academy of Finland board, and also a wonderful person. It's great to see you here, Leena. Welcome. And the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for your kind words. It's really great to be here and meet all old colleagues and also new friends. And thank you, David, for your excellent speech. And I think my lecture or speech can be regarded as a loose commentary speech to your points, very, very important points. A bit more than 10 years ago, we were asked to join, together with my dear colleague Päivi Honkatukia, who's here in the hall, a European Union funding project with an aim to explore the issues around criminality of migrant youth and other young people categorized as belonging to ethnic minorities. Criminality, ethnicity, youth. We were aware that the topic was not only complex and highly sensitive, but also a burning issue around which there was a great amount of emotionally charged mediated discussion and somewhat contested statistical data, but much less other kind of scientific knowledge, at least at that time in Finland. We were pondering upon how to pursue an ethically responsible research project in the context where the topic itself is charged with rude stereotypes, moral panics, and stigmatizations on the one hand, and historical power structures linked to colonialism, global injustice, and racism on the other hand. Should we assess the topic impossible to be studied in a meaningful and ethically sustainable way? The way that wouldn't cause any further harm, neither to the possible individual informants, nor to the communities which they represent in Finland or more globally. Is it possible to frame the research design sensibly so that it certainly would not give any ground for further segregation of those imagined communities that was created in the media debate around young people, criminality and ethnicity? If we engage ourselves in this study, is it a sign of our responsibility as the youth researchers, or can it be regarded as a sort of misuse of our position as privileged intellectuals in the northern part of the globe? Finally, should the decision to stay quiet and avoid the topic, so full of tensions, to be most responsible step to be made as youth researchers? After all, we decided to participate in the research project with all these ethical and geopolitical risks in mind, with a carefully prepared qualitative research design. For us, it was not only our intellectual privilege, but our societal responsibility to tackle the topic, which was loaded with populist knowledge. Our decision was based on a commitment to produce knowledge on the topic that needs to be examined as a polyphonic way as possible. What we didn't accept in this phase was the harm that the study could cause to ourselves as the researchers. No other project in which I have been involved as a researcher has resulted in such a strong public reaction, in the social media in particular, full of racist and sexist commentaries of ourselves as researchers and false interpretations of our research aims and results. With this personal experience in mind, I move to a more general part of my speech by pondering upon contemporary conditions for polyphony in the field of youth research. I argue that the vocation of youth research in Finland and abroad has indeed been premised on a firm idea of polyphony. In this context, the concept of polyphony doesn't refer only to the mobility across disciplinary paradigms or to thematic diversity. More importantly, it implies a unique research ethos, an engagement and a research design. And these three aspects of polyphony will somehow be present in my lecture. The concept of polyphony may sound strange in the context of youth research. In music, the polyphony has been understood as a sort of texture consisting of two or more simultaneous lines of melody, as opposed to music with just one voice or music with one dominant melodic voice accompanied by chords. In the field of social sciences and humanities, the term has widely been developed and discussed by the Russian philosopher and literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin, who has later inspired scholars working in a number of different traditions. For Bakhtin, polyphony is fundamental to human relationships of any kind. According to him, each voice has its own perspective and its own validity. Moreover, every person is influenced by others in an intertwined way, and no voice can be said to be isolated. According to Bakhtin's vision, polyphony refers to different perspectives that are not partial, complementary truths, neither are they fixed or closed. Rather, the dynamic interplay and interruption of perspectives are seen to produce new realities and novel ways of seeing. So, following Bakhtin's line of argument, it is the diversity, but also, or even more importantly, discrepancy, which gives polyphony its power. Polyphony gives a particular mission for the field of youth research as a whole, as we somehow heard also in David's speech. The legacy of accountability and commitment of youth researchers in relation to young people works towards radical widening of the worldviews and knowledge. This is particularly necessary when taking into account an unequal access of young people to the public discussion that concerns them, and often rude public categorization, use of the youth, of the rural youth, whether the intentions are related to the control, governance, or care. My first argument concerns the promotion of global attentiveness that reconsiders the epistemic foundation of youth research in order to challenge provincialism, be it intellectual or geopolitical. I will try to clarify this rather massive argument with some points. Nearly 90% of the world's youth live in the countries in the global south. In contrast, I would claim nearly 90% of academic youth research discussion concerns young people living in the global north, or in the so-called developed Western countries, at least if we think about the theoretical development of the youth research field. In addition, young people are in the forefront of the global migration, as heard in David's speech. The data of the United Nations Refugee Agency tells us that around 66 million people around the world have been forced from home last year. Among them are around 22 million refugees, and over 50% of the refugees are under the age of 18. So over 10 million underage young people are on the vulnerable position of transit, which doesn't fully fit into the dominant conceptual framework of transition found in the field of youth research. Many of them are forced to live in this precarious situation, fluctuating from mobility to immobility in a more or less persistent manner. These young people, among others, are a part of global power tensions connected with a complex set of colonial past and present, a sort of enduring dislocation, both in symbolic, in geographical, in political, and also in personal terms. Do these young people form a sort of subaltern group that cannot speak, to use Gayatri Spivak's term, not only for the political elite, but also for the scientific elite? Global South's youth-dense context, both in urban context, but at least in rural context, risk to remain a marginal topic for us. What's more, in the popular knowledge in the media, poverty, violence, and other spectacular youth-related problems tend to override the diversity of millions of young people's everyday lives, in particular when it comes to young people who live both in the most youth-dense part of the world and in the poorest part of the world, sub-Saharan Africa being one of those contexts. Gayatri Spivak, an Indian scholar, literary theorist, and feminist critic, claims that the subaltern is subaltern in part because it can't be represented adequately by academic knowledge. Spivak goes on to consider academic knowledge as a practice that may contribute to producing subalternity itself. This rather radical statement is worth reflecting upon, particularly when young people are in question. As I would like to highlight throughout my speech, the epistemological problem of knowing the other is not only an academic matter. The more politically heated the topic under discussion is, the more difficult it is for young people themselves to gain the authority to challenge the hegemonic knowledge that concerns them. Young migrants being in the jail, who we met with Päivi, made this point very clear. With this critical argument, I don't mean that we should all rush to the global south to make our hasty fieldworks there. Rather, the concept of polyphony implies here a sort of global youth researcher imagination that stimulates us to search for historical interconnections related to the global imbalance of knowledge production, including the preconceptions which we use to make sense of the social world. Global attentiveness, I think, means also that we rethink how we understand the traces of global relations, including raising nationalism across the very local issues that we are studying, whether our locus of analysis would be a local Finnish youth house, young people's leisure activities in Finland, socio-economic polarization in youth in Europe, or institutional arrangements related to child custody in the Nordic countries today and throughout history. Global attentiveness may mean also that we proactively try to enter into research dialogue of any sort with the people and with the concepts outside our academic comfort zones. To put these demands in more concrete terms, let me give a short illustration of the challenges of global attentiveness in one concrete research setting I was involved in. As a part of our 4-year research project, Young People and Political Engagements in Contemporary Africa, a multidisciplinary research group was engaged in doing qualitative case studies around Africa. I was particularly interested in searching for modes of artivism in young people's lives. In other words, how young people use the art, music in particular, as a form and platform of civic action. The context where this particular question was studied was Tunisia. My Finnish researcher colleague Sofia Laine and our Tunisian colleague Afifa Latvi were both familiar with the Tunisian political context, also relation to the youth, whereas my knowledge of the context to be studied was much thinner. As we were studying a very central environment for the revolution of the Arab countries, it seemed important to go beyond the mediatized news on the youth revolts in Muslim youth, in particular in urban environments. We decided to focus on the stories that the amateur musicians wanted to tell us on the roles of music in their lives. In addition, we listened to the music and lyrics, thus aiming to go beyond popular knowledge produced on youth resistance in the course of Arab revolution. The conceptual pair of youth and resistance is often treated in connection with manifest political participation, as well as overt dissent on the streets in urban environments again. This leads easily to somewhat spectacular accounts of young people's resistance, leaving aside its diverse everyday conditions and difficulties. When analyzing the data, we understood that it hardly fit into the customary conceptions of youth resistance, applied in the academic and public literature. That was the most familiar framework also for me. It demanded careful reading and rereading of the data and numerous discussions, in particular with our research colleague from Tunisia, in order to find out how to reformulate the conceptual framework so that it would be sensible both for the informants and for the geopolitical context, being very sensitive in this time in which the data had been collected. We started to apply the conceptual pair respectful resistance in order to refer to multiple tensions our informants faced when negotiating with different authorities while acting as musicians in Tunisia. These young musicians, after growing up during the President Ben Ali's authoritarian regime, were obliged to find out tactical ways of expressing their discontent in the circumstances in which the artistic space was limited, challenged, or dangerous. The concept of respectful resistance as an analytic framework allowed us to discuss how the young musicians strive for the social change while not insisting on an overt confrontation with the society and its social order. The understanding of resistance that involves both compromises and struggles does not mean that the musical scenes of the informants should be characterized as conservative, timid, or mainstream. The polyphonic understanding of the resistance was particularly important in the case of female musicians in Tunisia. Our female informants told us how the female artists have gradually reformed the field of music by successfully gaining the roles perceived as both decent and disruptive in the historical situation, where the women's space to reformulate the understanding of female respectability was and is still restricted. What's more, this kind of understanding of resistance entailed also a certain moral demand from the part of the young musicians themselves, with a claim that respect must be connected with recognition and rights. These musicians were aware of the over-politicized representation of Arab youth in North Africa, notably the Muslim youth in urban contexts. In contrast to this knowledge, they search for an unspectacular ways to tell about their lives, their dreams and demands, and thereby against a certain sort of moral panic produced around the youth in the Arab world. Same kind of demand was also expressed the migrant youth in the jail where we were doing our fieldwork with Päivi. This sort of reflection from Tunisia illustrates a couple of significant dimensions related to the concept of polyphony as global attentiveness. First, the inventive character embedded in the concept. Anthropologist Liisa Malkki emphasized the essential role of improvisation in the research processes. As Malkki states, the capacity to be surprised is one of the less teachable skills and also an underrated feature in the academic world. Instead of resting on broad categories and official knowledge, the researcher ought to generate an attitude of wonder and an ethos of rethinking and redescriptions. This is certainly one of the youth researchers' most important requirements and talents. Secondly, our journey to the Tunisian field reminded us about the importance of taking time to form out the research groups and dialogue so that it stimulates not only cross-disciplinarity per se, but also a radical contextual sensitivity. That is, thinking carefully and patiently, both in theoretical, in empirical, and political terms, inside and across time and place, thus resisting making any hasty analysis based on our familiar frameworks and discussions. This is, of course, a virtue that is more and more difficult to accomplish in the current academic field, which is characterized with an obligation to produce quick and firm results. A further challenge comes from our era of an increasing commodification of knowledge, which means that the scientific knowledge is losing its obvious legitimacy. Finally, polyphony as a global awareness means that we need to take our time to read academic papers written outside our Euro-American frameworks. This is not necessarily an easy task, at least if we focus on the scientific youth research journals. I faced this problem of global imbalance clearly when I worked as an editor and later as a main editor in the Journal of Young, being published by an international publisher, Sage Publication. By the global imbalance, I refer here to the issues and context treated in the journal, but also, even more importantly, to the author's backgrounds, as well as to the dominant paradigms of academic writing and reviewing traditions, as well, which all seem to prioritize the text coming from the global south. Youth researchers could be in the forefront in critically assessing and opening up our current international academic publishing traditions and environments to make them less exclusive. Every time I do it somehow. And now I go on to the dimension which also somehow was mentioned by the Dean in the morning. Youth researchers have always been keen on applying multi-method approaches to make sense of their research issue, thus aiming at tackling particular problems related to the ruptures between subaltern and academic knowledge already discussed. With the conceptual choice of multisensory approach, I aim at looking at methodologies as a particular form of generating diversified knowledge rather than as a pure methods. There are many ongoing debates that stimulate us to look at the multisensory approaches in a broad manner. An increasing attention to performative paradigm in qualitative methodologies, visual methodologies, participatory research approaches, and post-qualitative research ethos being critical towards certain trends of standardization and normativity of knowledge, to mention few. The crucial element of the polyphony demanding from these approaches is a sort of research ethos which Les Back, a British sociologist, calls as engaged listening. This kind of listening I envision here, referring to Back, is not a straightforward, momentary or easy business. The quest of engaged listening is a heavy task. How to be able, as the researcher, to give room and then to express her or himself the issues that can't be verbally formulated in any easy way, that have been muted, or that are not easily accessible in any evident way. When studying young people, this quest is particularly strong, as the scope of silent knowledge stored in young people's daily life may often be particularly hard to reach. By emphasizing the strength of creative methodologies, I don't want to state that there will be any easy recipes to the sensitive listening, or believe in any romanticized roles of the researcher who reaches the hidden knowledge from young people's secret lives. Maybe on the contrary. One central capacity of the youth researcher is to recognize the existence of inescapable ruptures in hearing and seeing the pieces of knowledge that are not anticipated or comfortable. We all know from our work as researchers that there is a wide range of youth experience that never come up in daily discussions, surveys, or interviews. Our experience of the young migrants being imprisoned due to their crimes revealed us in a rude manner that the more politically heated the topic under discussion is, the more difficult it is for young people themselves and for the researchers to gain the cognitive, intellectual authority to challenge the dominant knowledge of the very same topic. Lesbach talks about absolute moral categories attached to those young people or groups of people in particular that seems to require the parallel care and control from the part of the society. Such moral categories may become an easy source of knowledge production, leaving young people's complex sensitive experiences inaccessible. Engaged listening calls also a sort of multimodality in which corporality, text, words, rhythms, images, sounds, smells are all considered as a central ingredients for the academic knowledge. Here I come back to the question of attentiveness. Youth researchers are well aware of the ruptures of knowledge between young people and the adult researchers, as well as a package of silent knowledge staying privately in young people's minds. In spite of that, we tend to focus heavily on verbalized knowledge, a recorded voice. Margaret Mead's critical claim of discipline of words is pertinent also in the context of youth research. Again, one personal example. As a researcher interested in polyphonies, both in music and in research, I've tried to put attention to the question of sound in theoretical, methodological, and empirical terms. I'm pondering upon how diverse power structures in young people's lives, crossing gendered, racialized, class, and age-based dimensions, can be studied by listening to the sounds of the social world, thus making sense of acoustic environments around us. Who is entitled to speak loud in the streets, in the forests, in the public transport, at school, in the youth club? What kinds of sounds are regarded as unpleasant in these contexts for the researcher or for other people around the youth? And why? The sounds indeed have a huge impact on how we relate to ourselves, to others, and the places we inhabit. The element of sound may stimulate youth researchers to rethink our relationship to our research issues. It may also open up the possibilities for young people to express themselves beyond the words. As a young man living in Helsinki and born in Rwanda stated in one songwriting workshop I was involved in, I love making music because in this way I can both reveal and hide something important of myself, of my thoughts, of my emotions at the same time. Multisensory approach is not only a question of the formation of knowledge. It's also to do with analyzing and making the academic knowledge visible and audible to many publics. This leads to my third and concluding argument. Oh, it's incredible. Thus far, I have reflected upon the possibilities and challenges to promote a polyphonic ethos in the field of youth research. To conclude my speech, I take the virtue of polyphony at the more societal level. With these final remarks, I want to point out that the vocation of polyphony in youth research can't be seen only as a question of one's academic profession, but also as a quest for civil rights and responsibilities as the academic scholars. Civicus, a World Alliance for Citizen Participation, monitors the state of civil society all over the world. The Alliance published its latest State of Civil Society report with a reference to a global emergency, referring to extraordinary restrictions on the freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. It described the current state as a novel democratic crisis. The field of youth research is an essential part of the civil society. If we look at the global scale in particular, researchers' working conditions have become increasingly insecure, not only in terms of precarious funding, but also in terms of personal security. Insecurity is not a new phenomenon in the academic field, but it has been escalated due to both national and global tensions and the digitalization of the public discussion. At the same time, the researchers are encouraged or even insisted upon to promote the ideals of the open science. The current media society is a paradoxical environment for the researchers. Censorship and self-censorship caused by insecurity and fear meet seemingly open, digitalized media environments. We can trace many aspects that challenge the virtue of polyphony at the level of freedom of expression in the academic field. One risk is that our intellectual scopes, themes, methods, and publication forms become increasingly narrow. The polyphonic ways of doing academic work become certainly more marginalized in the situation in which an increasing amount of researchers experience daily threat. There's been a lot of discussion of self-censorship of the artists. The same discussion concerns also the field of researchers. If the youth researchers are obliged to restrict themselves to their safe comfort zones, there is a risk that the research communities become separate of the complex world that they should analyze and give advice to. This kind of separation, in its turn, may harm the possibilities for radical polyphonic research ethos. In addition, this may diminish the recognition of scientific knowledge in the society more broadly. Increasing insecurity of researcher communities is a worldwide phenomenon. We hear constantly about persecuted and imprisoned researchers or the total cut of academic funding in Turkey, Egypt, Russia. Regardless of whether we look at the insecurity of the research communities as an offense against human rights, as a personal experience, or as a threat to the virtue of polyphony, we can't let individual researchers to face this problem alone or to react only to the individual cases. This is a public issue that needs to be taken care of collectively. The researchers are not left alone. At the global level, Scholars at Risk network works to protect threatened scholars and to promote academic freedom around the world. Finland has taken some important steps this year. Finnish PEN, which is an international association of writers promoting freedom of expression, has found the Committee of Non-Fiction Writers and Researchers in February this year. Finnish PEN is right now calling researchers as its members. Also, Universities Finland UNIFI, a cooperational organization for Finnish universities, has taken stance against hate speech and other kinds of action that narrow down researchers' freedom of the expression during their work. The freedom of expression is a crucial matter for us. The condition for the vitality or for the polyphony of youth research is that we have the freedom to choose our research fields, methods, topics, and partners based on our intellectual curiosity and societal significance, not based on risk calculations. Delicate issues around young migrants in the jails in Finland or young musicians' political engagements in the streets of Tunisia merit to be explored also in the future. And to conclude my speech, I would like to show a short video which somehow gives flesh to those dimensions of polyphony I've raised up here. This video is called Anna tilaa, Give Space. The song has been done by the boys who are acting in the video, and it's a multilingual, unfortunately not in English, but you can experience the sound and rhythms.
Skole voi ottaa easy ja kirjoitella biisi. Kaveri, jonka näet monen kuukauden jälkeen. Ja se on sulle tärkeä, oli sitten aika, ilta tai aamu. Ei lopeteta, kunnes biisi valmiiksi on saatu. Äänitetä vaatekapis, jos ei oo tilaa. Vaatteet he viikattu, kaikkia likaa. Tila ympäriltua eri fiiliksi, jos on alasti. Ei voi ottaa iisisti, mulle natsa sellainen motherfucking kesäviidi. Hyvä rehti, jengi luotu piiriin. Sitä ei valota vaan yksi ihon väri. Hei, kaikki on kavereit, niin oot säkin. Sitä ei valota vaan yksi ihon väri. Hei, kaikki on kavereit, niin oot säkin. Anna tilaa, hei, anna tilaa. Oi, sitten valkoinen tai ruskeeni tulevaisuutta päin mä pusken. Anna tilaa, hei, anna tilaa.
Hansi lähtee ulos ja antaa itselleni tilaa. Kävele ulos, kelaa, miksi ihmiset mua tsiikaa. Kelaa päässä, onks mus jotain vikaa? Kelaa, onks jossain mun kehossani vikaa? Ihmiset kelaa, mitkä asiat tässä valtakunnassa pahentaa. Lopettakaa kaikki rasismia, väkivaltaa. Tai miksi meistä jotkut ei kunnioittaa lakia? Tai miksi koulu kiusahtuu kääntää itselleen takia?
Anna tilaa, hei, anna tilaa. Oi, sitten valkoinen tai ruskeeni tulevaisuutta päin mä pusken. Anna tilaa, hei, anna tilaa. Anna tilaa, hei, anna tilaa. Oi, sitten valkoinen tai ruskeeni tulevaisuutta päin mä pusken. Anna tilaa, hei, anna tilaa.
Anna tilaa. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. We have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion, and also for David, and as well as Lena. So if you have any comments to make or questions to ask, this would be a perfect time. Please also use the mic, because as I mentioned earlier, it's being streamed, and that way we get the comments there as well. Vesa, there's one.
Yes, thank you very much for your interesting presentations. I would like to ask David concerning this dimension that you wanted to bring into youth research, rurality. You began your speech by referring to some classics of sociology who have not been talking about rurality. But we know that they have not either been talking about many other things like emotions, gender, and many other things. And also about race, they didn't talk very much. But now we heard that they are not either talking about rurality, so they are, and nature also. They are not talking about nature very much, at least. But I tried to understand what you thought, what you talked, but I really didn't get to the stake, or I didn't understand how the fact that rurality has been abandoned in the research, and if it is included as you proposed, concretely, what does it bring? What new insights or what new kind of results does it bring to the youth research? From your own experience, you also told about your own research, but even though I didn't really catch your point.
Okay, is this on? Yeah. Okay, well, the reason that I would raise classical sociological theory is because it shows one instance of the way that intellectual frameworks develop in ways that relate to broader kind of cultural and geographic processes. And then the emergence of the notion of modernity and its enormous significance and its connection with colonialism is a great example of that. So the very concept of youth emerges as intertwined with the assumptions that are made about modernity and about development and about what development is. In contemporary youth research, one of the key frameworks for understanding what youth itself is the notion of transition. And the idea here is that youth is a process that happens over time in which young people transition into becoming adults, and they in this respect kind of develop in this sense. So in this sense, the development of youth mirrors the development of the concept of modernity in its connection with colonialism. So what I would suggest is that when you think about youth outside of the categories that have been used to form the notion of modernity and the notion of youth in general, then it's an ontological shift actually in what it is that you're studying. So you're no longer studying a process that unfolds homogeneously in time. You're understanding now the production of global difference, and you're situating youth in terms of the production of global difference. So there's a number of concrete empirical programs that could come out of this and which I could describe, but I think for the field in general, it's a basic ontological shift in what we think we're looking at. And the consequences of it are to reposition our endeavour from tracking a process that develops over time to critiquing a lot of the cultural and epistemological processes that have shaped what we think of as modernity and as late modernity and what we think of as development in general. I'm not sure if that is a great answer to your question, but that's kind of what I wanted to share anyway. So.
Thank you. We still have time for another one. There's one in the middle.
Hi, my name is Päivi Honkatuki. I come from the University of Tampere, and I would like to thank both of you for your fine, inspiring talks. And while Lena was talking about our joint research some years ago, it brought back me some memories from the field work. Lena, you talked a lot of very inspiring things as well. But this aspect of recollecting the certain moments in the field, it raised me the idea when I was listening to David, whether your ideas on the epistemological faults or kind of ideas that rurality is not valued so much as urban spheres. What kind of implications your reflections, have they had some implications in the field work when you have been interacting with young people? Have you kind of challenged this division with young people, or somehow tried to raise their awareness that there is some value in the rural area and rural context as well?
Thanks. That's a really good question and a really hard one to answer. Okay. So in general, the field work that I do isn't politically engaged in the way that you have described. Not that that isn't really important, I just haven't done it. So I don't tend to try to raise consciousness when I talk to young people, but I am sometimes surprised by the things that they say, where they'll say things like, well, this town, there's nothing happening here, or something like that. And you talked about an attitude of wonder, That's such a mundane thing for somebody to say sometimes. But it really surprised me because it's not possible that there's ever nothing happening anywhere, right? There's always something happening, okay? So I suppose those moments where young people kind of devalue their own town struck me, and I tried to treat them as not mundane. I tried to have that kind of sense of interest and wonder in what they were saying. So it led to more questions about, well, what do you mean there's nothing happening here? I mean, what is happening here? It pushed the project in new directions to be surprised, I guess, because also when when someone is devalued more generally culturally, you often, or at least, I didn't necessarily expect them to kind of just agree with that, and to just kind of reproduce their own devaluing. I thought I would find this sort of resistance and stuff. And I mean, there was a bit, but in general, not really, to tell you the truth. And I was surprised by that. So I wouldn't say that I tried to raise awareness, but when I took for granted that rurality is epistemologically valuable, and when I encountered young people who did not agree, that was a surprise, and that was productive methodologically, both in terms of the way the interviews went, and then later on when I came to analyse. Yeah. Okay. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, we have 1 minute for a good comment, if somebody would like to make one. Or then we can also use it for me making a couple of announcements. Thank you so much for both of the keynotes. That really, truly, an extremely interesting 1.5 hours. And then I'll make a couple of announcements in Finnish. 1. Kohta on tarjolla kahvia. Nauttikaa siitä. Kahvin aikana Nuorisotutkimuslehden päätoimittaja Lotta Haikkola on suurin piirtein tuolla. Ja hänen kanssa voi käydä juttelemassa esimerkiksi siitä, että haluaisiko itse laittaa artikkelin siihen lehteen. 2. Kahvin jälkeen jatkuu työryhmät. Osa jatkuu IT-siivessä ja osa TS-siivessä. Ja siltä varalta, että et tiedä missä on joku hirveätä meteliä siellä. Siltä varalta, että et tiedä missä on IT-siipi tai TS-siipi, niin meillä on 2 ystävällistä ihmistä opastamassa niihin tuossa kahvin loppupuolella ennen puolta, jotta puolelta pääsee työryhmät sitten alkamaan. Nousisiko he ystävällisesti seisomaan? Ihmiset tietää, keitä te olette. Eli tässä on Antti ja Kaisa. Antti vie IT-siipen ja Kaisa vie TS-siipen. Eli sen näköiset henkilöt ettikää, jos ette tiedä mihin mennä. Kiitoksia tähänastisesta ja hauskaa päivää teille. Hyvää kahvia.